Thank you for that introduction. I'm not going to talk about drugs other than obviously cannabinoids, but in the spirit of full disclosure, I don't have any business or other contacts with suppliers of marijuana or anything like that. But I should tell you that I serve on the Physicians Advisory Board of Connecticut's medical marijuana program. And I've served on that for the last 5 years since its inception. I'm funded by several NIH funding agencies and NARSAD. Our group has a clinical trial with the drug called Cannabinoids, which I'll talk briefly about. That's funded by a company called INSYS. Dr. Mohini Ranganathan is the principal investigator on that study, but she's part of my group, so I should tell you about that. So. I'm going to talk a little about cannabis and the brain cannabinoid system, and then sort out some of the evidence about the potential therapeutic use of cannabinoids, and then talk about the safety of cannabinoids and how relevant that might be to clinical practice, and then open it up for questions and answers. So just to put things in perspective, the landscape has really changed. California was the first state to legalize marijuana. And as of December, and this could have changed between December and now, there are at least 28 states that have legalized medical marijuana. There are states that have legalized recreational marijuana, that's 4 and counting. And it's just a matter of time by which other states are going to either legalize medical or recreational cannabis use. So let me tell you a little about the cannabis and the brain cannabinoid system. For those of you who are interested in your plants, there are several different kinds of cannabis plants. The shortest one, Cannabis indica, is one that grows in the Himalayas. It doesn't have to compete for other vegetation for sunlight, and that's why it's short. Cannabis ruderalis contains almost no THC, and then the more common one is Cannabis sativa. All the action is in these capitate trichomes, these glistening bodies that you see on the far right, and that's where all the action is. That's where THC, or the principal psychoactive constituent of marijuana, is. There are at least about 100 cannabinoids present in cannabis. The most important ones, the principal active constituent of cannabis is THC, or delta-9 THC. Another important one is cannabidiol, which I'll come to in a moment. So THC and cannabidiol are the most important ones, but there are 100 others. And why should you know this? I think it's important for you to know this, especially from the perspective of medical marijuana. So I would argue that there's nothing that we prescribe that has 100 constituents. Most of the drugs that we prescribe maybe have 1 or 2 active constituents. So when someone says they're prescribing marijuana, they're actually prescribing a collection of 100 cannabinoids, terpenoids, flavonoids. I would argue we don't do anything like that in medicine. So that's the first thing. Also, the other important thing to remember is that studies that have been done with THC don't extrapolate to studies done with cannabis, because THC is much less than cannabis. Cannabis contains, as you just saw, many other constituents. So while there's been a lot of interest in THC and cannabis for a number of years, we really didn't know how it worked until 1988. In 1988, the cannabinoid receptor, the CB1 receptor, was identified and cloned. And we now know that there's another cannabinoid receptor, the CB2 receptor. The CB1 receptor is principally in the brain. The CB2 receptor is principally peripheral, primarily on lymphocytes and other white blood cells, though in the last few years there's increasing recognition of CB2 receptors in certain parts of the brain. Cannabinoids may also produce effects via actions at the vanilloid receptors and some other receptors that haven't yet been named, this orphan G-protein coupled receptor. This is a slice from a rat brain showing for the first time the distribution of CB1 receptors, and as you can see, there's a high distribution in the hippocampus, the cortex, the caudate putamen, and the substantia nigra, and on the far right, the cerebellum, the layers of the cerebellum. We now have the capacity to actually look at CB1 receptors in vivo. Here at Yale, we have access to a CB1 receptor ligand, and I'll show you some data later about this, and the distribution of the receptors in the brain is consistent with the known effects of cannabis, including effects on the hippocampus or memory, cortex, etc. So, morphine is to endorphins, as cannabinoids or cannabis or THC is to anandamide and 2-HE. So the endogenous ligand for the CB1 receptor, there are several, but the two main ones are anandamide, named after the Sanskrit word anand or bliss, and 2-HE, that's the other. There are several other endocannabinoids, but we are not sure exactly what role they play. These are the two main ones. We now know a lot about the cannabinoid brain, the endocannabinoid system. This is a very difficult slide for you to read, but take my word for it. What we know is that we know there are distinct synthetic pathways for both of these two ligands. So we know the enzymes that are involved in the biosynthesis of anandamide and 2-HE. We know how they are degraded. And what this offers us is an opportunity to perhaps modulate this system towards therapeutics. So there are drugs that are currently being tested, including a study that we are doing with a drug called a FAR inhibitor, or fatty acid amide hydrolase inhibitor, which breaks down breaks down anandamide. What it basically does is it increases brain endocannabinoid levels, and we've just completed a study in cannabis dependence showing that this FAR inhibitor was successful in reducing cannabis withdrawal and reducing cannabis use. This was an early phase 2 study, and we're hoping to replicate it. You should also know that the cannabis that you or your parents or your friends smoked in the 60s is very different from the cannabis that's available right now in one important way, and that is that the THC content of cannabis has increased almost by 3 to 4-fold in typical samples of cannabis. So it's tough to extrapolate studies that may have been done in the 60s and 70s to the current situation where cannabis is much more potent. Furthermore, there are now a dazzling array of highly potent products available with interesting names, and these have a THC concentration of up to 90%. Just as a reminder, the typical THC content of regular cannabis is about 12%, so this is almost 10 times higher in THC content. Furthermore, the content of another important constituent of cannabis, cannabidiol, has decreased as the THC content of cannabis has gone up. And why is that important? It's important because cannabidiol, or CBD, has been shown in a number of studies to have anxiolytic effects and to have antipsychotic effects, including in one clinical trial where it was compared to a drug like Haldol and was shown to be as effective as that drug in the treatment of acute psychosis. So what that means is that some of the internally protective constituents of cannabis are being bred out as the THC content is increasing, and the implications are that one might experience more unpleasant effects in those people who are not familiar with this kind of cannabis. So the route of consumption also makes a huge difference. Cannabis is mostly smoked. More recently, people use vaporizers or vaping pens to use cannabis. But when it's consumed orally, it has a completely different pharmacokinetic profile, which has important consequences. And what I mean by that is the following. When someone's smoking cannabis or vaping cannabis, they take a hit, they wait for the effects, which are almost immediate. If it's too much, they don't take any more. If it's too little, they take another hit. What happens when you consume cannabis orally is that the effects only emerge about an hour and a half to 3 hours later. So you can't titrate the effects. And so if you're prone to have an unpleasant reaction, or you're anxiety prone, it may be too late for you to do anything once you've consumed it. And this is really important. And young kids sometimes will take, instead of 1 brownie, they'll take 5 brownies because nothing has happened after half an hour. And that's ripe for bad consequences. There are a dazzling array of edible products available in Colorado. Here are some examples of them, including, I don't know if you can see from the back, brownies, etc. Some that are specifically targeting children with interesting names like the Klondike bar, and sodas that are rich in THC content. Vaping pens, these are discrete devices, no bigger than a regular pen. And when people vape a liquid containing THC, unlike when you smoke cannabis, there really isn't any aroma, because what contributes to the aroma of smoking cannabis are terpenoids. And those terpenoids are really devoid in a solution that just contains THC. So you could be sitting next to someone in an airport or in a public area and they could be vaping and you would be blissfully unaware. Products like this, Nutella, these are all from Colorado, and there are even coupons you can get to get a discount on your next joint. So what's the impact of legalization? I mean, has legalization for medical purposes or recreational purposes really had an impact on young people? And this is really relevant to the work that you all do. What's the deal with the high schoolers? And this is fairly compelling data. Shown here are the states in blue where cannabis has not been legalized, the states in red where cannabis has been legalized for medical purposes, and the states in green, a few of them, where cannabis has been legalized also for recreational purposes. And what you can see is that amongst high schoolers, there are much higher rates of cannabis use by kids living in those states where it has been legalized either for medical or recreational purposes. Connecticut is shown here in yellow. So far, cannabis is approved for medical purposes, but not for recreational purposes. This is data from a recent paper by Deborah Hassan in the Archives of General Psychiatry, showing that the rates of the increase in cannabis use amongst adults is significantly greater in those states where cannabis has been legalized relative to those states where cannabis is not legalized. So this kind of makes common sense. If it's legalized, more people are going to use it. So there have been studies asking high schoolers, if cannabis were legalized, would you be more likely to use it? And the resounding response is, yes, indeed, they'd be much more likely to use it. So if we do legalize cannabis here in the state of Connecticut for recreational purposes, I think we can expect to see that more young people are going to be using it. For those of you who have been following what's happening in the state of Connecticut, there was a bill to legalize recreational cannabis, and there was a hearing in April. I went and testified there, and for now at least that bill hasn't passed, but I don't think people are going to give up on that. It's very likely that this bill will be revisited in August, and the main driving force behind it is really revenue. This is the way that the state of Connecticut wants to balance its budget. They expect a windfall in taxes and licenses, etc., and that may be much more powerful than any scientific testimony that I can provide. So, weeding out the evidence. What is the evidence on the use of cannabis as a potential treatment for psychiatric conditions? I'm not going to talk about medical conditions. I'm just going to focus on psychiatric conditions. The next slide is a very busy slide. I don't expect you to read it from behind. The psychiatric conditions are listed in red, and they include post-traumatic stress disorder, agitation and Alzheimer's disease, Tourette syndrome, and autism. So there are a number of states that have approved cannabis for post-traumatic stress disorder, and one state that's approved it for autism. But I hope you can get the impression that there's a lot of variability in the states that have approved these cannabis for these various conditions. So we decided to review the evidence. This was work done with Rajiv Radhakrishnan, who's a PGY, who's now a fellow in my program, and Sam Wilkinson, who's a former Yale resident who's working here. And we decided to look at the evidence. And I would argue that most of the data that's been used by the states to legalize medical cannabis, I would argue, is based on anecdotal evidence rather than experimental evidence. That is to say, I have a friend who has PTSD and he smokes weed, and he feels much better after he smokes weed. So that's the level of evidence. So we decided to look at this in a systematic way using a well-accepted method of evaluating evidence in the medical literature called the grade system. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but basically our conclusion was, at least for psychiatric indications, most of the studies were problematic. They had a poor design, poor execution. They relied exclusively on subjective effects. They failed to demonstrate clear clinical benefit. Most of the studies were not with cannabis. Most of the studies were with THC. And as I said, THC is very different from cannabis, and cannabis is not the same as THC. So there were many problems with this. I'll just give you some examples. There were 4 studies with PTSD, in PTSD. None of the studies were with cannabis, all those studies were with THC. And I draw your attention to the last column. Basically, our conclusion was that these studies were of very low quality, low evidence. Either the sample sizes were small, the outcome measures were not pre-specified, etc. These are some of the other studies that were done in PTSD. There were 2 studies published in Tourette syndrome, which may be of some interest to you. Both studies were done by the same German researcher who administered dronabinol, or synthetic THC, not cannabis, to adults with Tourette syndrome and found some small effect. But again, there were some serious problems with the study in terms of the outcome measures and the blinding, etc. So, in our opinion, and this is a paper that was published last year in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, there is very little evidence to support the use of cannabinoids, cannabis or THC, in the treatment of any of the psychiatric conditions that I've mentioned, including PTSD, autism, ADHD, agitation and Alzheimer's disease, or Tourette syndrome. Having said that, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be actually looking at this in a systematic way. And there are studies that are ongoing, including, I believe, one by Michael Block, looking at cannabinoids for Tourette's. And it remains to be seen what the data or the evidence will be generated from these controlled clinical trials. So now shifting focus on safety. Safety, both acute and chronic. So one of the more robust effects of cannabinoids is on cognition. And I would think about these effects in terms of temporality. So there are acute effects that last for up to 6 hours. There are some residual effects, and then there are some longer-term effects that are perhaps much more controversial. There's absolutely no doubt that there are acute effects, and those acute effects include effects on many different kinds of memory, including spatial memory, working memory, procedural memory, reaction time, different tests of attention, set shifting, motor coordination, and information processing. So a wide array of cognitive effects. And I would remind you that some of these cognitive functions are really critical in driving a motor vehicle. And that's one of the other issues that I will spend some time talking about. So we know that cannabinoids at different doses affect many of those cognitive functions that are important in operating a motor vehicle. And the data on cannabinoids and driving comes from basically 3 lines of research. One are the epidemiological studies, or the observational field studies, looking at people who have been involved in motor vehicle accidents, testing them for cannabinoids, and then making inferences from that. And at the other extreme are experimental studies where cannabis or cannabinoids are administered to individuals, and either some discrete cognitive function that's involved in driving is tested, or in the case of some of the studies we are doing, they look at driving simulation. And what's clear from all these studies is that, one, cannabinoids impair many cognitive functions that are involved in driving. Cannabinoids impair driving on driving simulators, and your likelihood of being involved in a motor vehicle accident if you're under the influence of cannabis is about 2-fold. The problem, of course, is that, and this is a very real practical issue that we touched upon in this recent legislative hearing, is that it's very hard to conclusively determine that if someone is involved in a motor vehicle accident and tests positive for cannabis, to determine that at the moment that they were driving, they were under the influence, because you could have smoked 1 week ago and your urine would still be positive for cannabis. And so it's hard to really attribute causality. And this is a real problem for law enforcement. This is one problem. The other problem is that we don't have a field sobriety test that adequately distinguishes cannabis from other drugs. And so law enforcement are up in arms because they're not going to have the tools to be able to test people with that. The other issue is the relationship with alcohol. We have a study funded by the NIAAA where we're asking the following question. It's conceivable that someone may go out and have 1 drink of alcohol, which would get their blood alcohol level to well below the legal limit. They may be fine. But if on top of that they smoke a joint, smoke some weed, the combination of the two might have effects on driving that would really tip them over the edge. And this has not been studied in a systematic way. So we're doing exactly that study in the lab, in my lab at the VA, where We are administering alcohol in controlled doses and THC in controlled doses, and having people drive a simulator. To make it even more challenging, we're doing what a number of young people and older people do, which is we text them while they're on the driving simulator. We give them a phone and we have a controlled script where we text them, and they're supposed to respond to us while they're driving under the influence of both. Well, our preliminary data suggests that the combination of the two may have more than additive effects, may have more synergistic-like effects. We haven't looked at the effect of texting on top of that. That's the next thing that we'd like to do. But this is another problem. I mean, I-95 is a death trap. I drive there every day, and having people who are stoned and drunk is not a good thing. I saw a recent paper from Canada which estimated the cost of motor vehicle accidents related to cannabis. As you know, cannabis is approved or legalized in many parts of Canada. And their estimate was that this was, I believe it was more than $300 million, the annual costs of motor vehicle accidents, both in terms of deaths and injuries, ambulance calls, etc. So I tried to extrapolate that to Connecticut, and it would be several $100 million. And it would probably offset whatever revenue the state is going to generate and cause much hardship to families and other people. Okay, so what's happened in Colorado, which is a great experiment, and perhaps we in Connecticut can watch and learn from what's happening in Colorado. And in Colorado, it looks like, indeed, after the legalization of cannabis, there has been an increase in the number of motor vehicle accidents. In fact, there was, at one point, the surrounding states were actually filing a class action lawsuit against Colorado because people were going into Colorado, buying cannabis or getting high, coming back into their state and getting into motor vehicle accidents. Okay, these are the kinds of ads that you can see in Colorado where they're actually promoting the use of cannabis instead of drinking because the impression is that your driving is going to be less impaired by cannabis than it would be by drinking alcohol. This is kind of outrageous, but this is a billboard, from Denver. Okay, so what are the other implications? So if you look at data from the Colorado Department of Education, it looks like the number of expulsions that are related to cannabis have increased following both commercialization and legalization. I gave a talk a few months ago in Wallingford, and the principal of the school said that this was the first year where the number of infractions related to cannabis exceeded the number of infractions related to alcohol. So we are beginning to see that even in our own state. So what about persistent cognitive impairments? There's a lot of debate about this, a lot of controversy about this. Some studies suggesting that there are persistent effects, others suggesting they're not. I'll draw your attention to one study that I think the design of this study was really great. This was the Dunedin study. Everyone born in the county of Dunedin in New Zealand have been followed now for the last 43 years. The study wasn't exactly about cannabis, it was about many health outcomes. And what they had the opportunity to do was to follow everyone, and they have a 95% retention since in 2010. So that's pretty good for a study. The sample size was several thousand. And what they had the opportunity to do in this Dunedin study was they tested people between the age of 7 and 13 on a battery of cognitive tests. And then they asked them between the age of 18 and 38, they were evaluated for their use of cannabis on 5 different occasions. And then they tested them again at age 38 with another battery of cognitive tests. And one of the important what they measured was IQ. So what did they find? This is a study that received quite a bit of public attention in the last 4 years or so by Madeline Meyer. What they found was that if the more times that you were diagnosed with a cannabis use disorder, the greater the decrease in your IQ over time. And shown on the far right are the effect sizes. So if on those 3 occasions you were diagnosed with a cannabis use disorder, you had the greatest reduction in IQ. This is another way, probably simpler way of showing it, that those who were persistent users of cannabis had about an 8-point drop in IQ over the course of the next 30 years or so. They included alcohol and other drug use into the model, years of education, socioeconomic status, and that did not explain the drop in IQ. Were these impairments functional? As in, could they be appreciated to the common eye? And so they asked family members of those participants about whether they noticed cognitive impairments in their family members who were using. And indeed, they described things like, I sent him to the grocery store to buy this, and he came back with that, and it didn't match. And those are the kinds of things that, that their family members noticed. Are adolescents more vulnerable? And this is really important. And this slide shows you the decline in IQ over time, depending on the number of times you're diagnosed with cannabis dependence if you're an adolescent. And this is what it is when if you're an adult. So it clearly looks like adolescent use is associated with greater reductions in cognitive function, including IQ. And does quitting restore functioning? This is an important issue, especially with regard to the question of persistent effects. There's some data that suggests that if you stop smoking cannabis, within 4 weeks or so, whatever cognitive impairments you've had will have gone away. There are other studies that suggest that you can continue to detect impairments well after that. In this study, they had an opportunity to look at those who used cannabis in adolescence but stopped using it. And it looks like even if they stopped using cannabis, shown in the left column, they continued to have cognitive impairments that lasted through adulthood. So these data would suggest that adolescent but not adult exposure is associated with persistent deficits, and these deficits may be irreversible. So these effects cannot be, as I said, explained by lack of education. They are functionally significant. They tend not to be specific. They are seen in many cognitive domains. And it's related to the dose of exposure, years of exposure, and the age of onset of cannabis use. So one of the challenges in studying this is the confounding effects of other drugs. So people who use cannabis often use other drugs, including alcohol, nicotine, etc. Alcohol could cause other impairments. Nicotine could perhaps improve some of the cognitive impairments that one might see with cannabis. Reverse causality, etc. So obviously, one can't do a laboratory study. It would be impossible for me to take a group of adolescents, give them cannabis, and then follow them for 10 years. But we were thinking of how might we be able to answer this question of long-term cannabis use without the confound of other drugs where exposure is very early and heavy. So we've stumbled upon a group where the central tenet of their belief is this. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle and herb, and when I mean herb, I'm talking about herb cannabis, for the service of man. These are people for whom cannabis is a sacrament. It's sanctioned. They're forbidden from using alcohol. Again, they invoke the Old Testament. He shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. Their exposure to cannabis is massive. I had to change the scale that I took to measure cannabis because it wasn't good enough. Exposure is very early. Sometimes exposure is in utero. They have no major problems with procuring cannabis that some people may have in Western societies where it's still illegal. There's a potential to quantify their exposure to cannabis because they don't cut their hair and they don't treat their hair with shampoos and other things that might prevent you from actually detecting drugs in hair samples. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the studies on cannabis and persistent effects relies on self-report. And finally, one of the unfortunate things is they shun Western medicine because they are quite suspicious of the motives of the white establishment. Anyhow, I was able to engage this group and go down and visit them and collect some pilot data. They have a Judeo-Christian, their faith is Judeo-Christian based. This is their church, which is an outdoor church. In the center, as you can see, is a tabernacle. Within that tabernacle is not a chalice, but is a large bong, which is shared by everyone attending the service. There are young people running around, kids running around who are exposed to it. And women don't stop smoking cannabis during pregnancy. So this allows for us to actually look at what in utero exposure to cannabis might do. So these are just some preliminary data that I'd like to share with you. Their mean use of cannabis was 41,000 hits in their lifetime. Their leader was my age, 54. So they had massive exposure to cannabis. Many of them had tried to quit, and I was careful in asking them why. And often the reason was they didn't want to get into trouble at their workplace. And many of them had attempted to quit. They begrudgingly acknowledged to me that perhaps they were smoking too much, and this was affecting their functionality. So we've looked at a couple of outcome measures, including learning and memory, measured here by the Hopkins Verbal Learning Test. We also looked at a continuous performance test to look at attention, and we looked at a measure of schizotypy. And the three groups represented here are the cases in red, their sibling controls who were not part of the group, so they had a shared genetic and family background, and general controls who were drawn from a sample of, I believe they were Seventh-day Adventists, who shared many of the beliefs other than the use of cannabis. And you can see here that the cases had the worst performance on measures of learning and memory, attention, and they had a significant schizotypy. We looked at another measure of learning and memory using the Cogstate's International Shopping List task, and we find a big difference between the controls and cases, and exposure to lifetime exposure to cannabis correlated with their performance on this verbal memory task. Similarly, there was a big difference in schizotypy between the controls and this group. So we have this pilot data. We've now submitted a grant application to NIDA to actually expand this study and do a much larger study, and we hope to hear sometime in August. So, tolerance, dependence, and withdrawal. So there's absolutely no question that cannabis is addictive. This is a question that I still get asked even at scientific meetings about whether it's addictive or not. But yes?
I don't know whether you're going to talk about this later, but are there any studies on chronic use of cannabis and psychosis?
Yes, I'm coming to that.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So is cannabis addictive? Yes, if we use all the criteria that we use to describe other addictions, cannabis is addictive. People can start using more over time. They can't stop using. They spend more money using. They make many attempts to quit. And now DSM-5 recognizes that there is a distinct cannabis withdrawal syndrome, which wasn't previously recognized in previous versions of DSM. About 10% of people who try will become dependent, and that increases if they are adolescents. In adolescents who use on a daily basis, up to 35% of them will become dependent over time. And in this survey done, published in 2012, 3 out of 10 cannabis users will manifest some symptom of a cannabis use disorder, as in impairments at work, impairments at school, etc. As I mentioned, we have the capacity now to look at brain cannabinoid receptors, and we did a study on the CNRU here at Yale, where we took heavy cannabis users. These were people who were using once a day, and we hospitalized them. We first scanned them at baseline within 12 hours of their last use, and then we scanned them again after 2 days of being locked on the inpatient unit, where we had confirmed abstinence, and then we paid them a lot of money to stay abstinent for 4 weeks and scan them again. We find about a 15% reduction in CB1 receptor availability in these daily cannabis users relative to controls. What it looks like is, over time, if they remain abstinent, shown here in a representative subject, that there is some recovery of CB1 receptors over a 4-week period. This is good news that there's some recovery. However, in our sample, in our small sample, which we are now replicating with funding from NIDA, the cannabis-dependent subjects never quite reached the CB1 receptor availability of healthy controls, shown here in green. It could be that if we wait long enough, that may be the case, or it could be that they never actually get to the same point as healthy controls. So what about cannabis and psychosis? This is the reason I got into this field, because I was intrigued by this association between cannabis and psychosis. And I would argue that there are perhaps 3 distinct relationships between cannabis and psychosis. And those are basically temporally defined. But before that, I want to make a distinction between psychotic symptoms as in discrete symptoms of hallucinations, delusions, etc., and a psychotic disorder, which is much more than psychotic symptoms. And this will be important for you to keep in mind as I present to you some of these data. So the first relationship is the following, where there is the occurrence of psychosis, of psychotic symptoms, immediately following exposure that lasts for perhaps a few hours and then resolves spontaneously and completely. I have spent a good part of the last 20 years doing laboratory studies with intravenous THC to look at the effects of intravenous THC on measures of psychosis. And I should say that this is not something that is new or has just been recognized. This was described as far back as 1845 by the French physician Moreau, where he described in hashish users symptoms that we would associate with schizophrenia: paranoid ideas, illusions, hallucinations, delusions, depersonalization. Okay, so we've done some studies with intravenous THC at different doses given to healthy subjects. These were healthy subjects who were very carefully screened for any psychiatric disorder, including a family history of psychosis. So we gave them IV THC, and then we used a well-validated measure called the Positive and Negative Syndrome scale to measure symptoms of psychosis. Well, you might ask, what kind of symptoms of psychosis did healthy people have when they were given IV THC? This is a smattering of some of the effects that they described. I couldn't keep track of my thoughts. Everything was happening in staccato. Everything was happening at once. My thoughts were fragmented. Past, present, future all seemed to be happening at once. Unusual thoughts. I thought you could read my mind. That's why I didn't answer. I thought my mind was nude. One of our subjects, who happened to be a Yale medical student, thought he could see into the future, thought he was God. This is not a reflection of the grandiosity of Yale medical students. And then paranoia, which is frequently reported in even amongst lay people. One of our subjects refused to answer any of the questions of the cognitive task because she thought we were trying to trick her by changing the rules of the task, which wasn't the case. One of our subjects thought we were continuing to give him THC through the blood pressure machine, and when he excluded that as a possibility, he thought we were continuing to give it to him through the sheets of the hospital bed. So again, this is THC, this is IV THC, and the doses are much higher than what most people would use. But the point is that THC at certain doses and certain conditions can induce symptoms that resemble some of the symptoms of schizophrenia, even in people who've been excluded for any risk of psychosis. We also saw a number of quasi-psychotic symptoms that didn't quite reach the threshold of psychosis, where both the clinician rating the subject and the subject himself or herself reported having spaced out, seemed separated or detached from what was going on, had done or said something bizarre and needed redirection, and subjects reported alterations in perceptions of time, external reality, etc., etc. We've since this study in 2004 have done about between 800 and 1,000 infusions, and across a range of doses, we find the same effect. So this is not a one-off. This is something that we've seen across studies. There are other groups now in the UK that have used a similar paradigm to what we've used and have replicated some of the work that I'm showing you here. In addition, one of the more robust effects of THC was on verbal memory, measured here using the Hopkins Verbal Learning Test. And you can see here in a dose-dependent manner, THC reduced immediate recall and delayed recall in these healthy subjects. We also looked at objective measures. Shown here is data from a P300 task. A P300 task is a target detection task where subjects hear auditory clicks, and then interspersed within those clicks is a target where they have to press a spacebar, and sometimes they also hear a novel sound like a dog barking, and that elicits a waveform which is about 300 milliseconds after the stimulus, which is a positive inflection, and that's a P300. And you can see here that THC in a dose-dependent manner reduced amplitude of the P300. Why is it important? It's important because it's seen in a number of neuropsychiatric conditions, and some would argue is a biomarker of schizophrenia. We also looked at steady-state driving using a auditory steady-state driving task. Here what you're looking at is gamma driving, and again we find that THC, at least at the higher dose, appeared to reduce inter-trial coherence which again is also shown to be altered in schizophrenia and psychotic disorders. And finally, more recently, we've looked at a measure of cortical noise using this measure called Lempel-Ziv complexity, which was developed for telecommunications, but is a way of looking at noise within a system. And we find that THC in a dose-dependent manner increased cortical noise in healthy subjects. I'm a clinician. I still treat patients with schizophrenia, and one of the questions that I've always been befuddled by is my patients say to me, when I smoke cannabis, my symptoms get better, and then I see the same patient down in the ER, and there's this mismatch between what they are saying and what we are finding. And so we decided to do the study in real time, because most of the studies that had been previously done were retrospective studies that relied on retrospective subjective report. And we know that in issues of substance abuse, there's denial and rationalization. Furthermore, THC or cannabis can disrupt memory, and so people may recall in an erroneous manner. So we did a study exactly like the study I showed you, where we invited a small group of patients with schizophrenia and gave them THC, and no surprise, we found that it worsened their symptoms. But what it did do is it did reduce their anxiety, and so their net perception was that the distress related to the symptoms, even though the symptoms got worse, was that they felt better. We found that patients with schizophrenia were more vulnerable to the effects of THC on a measure of psychosis and on a measure of verbal learning that I've shown you previously. So that's one relationship. The second relationship is the following, where there's onset of psychosis that occurs typically within immediately after exposure, but here the psychosis lasts for a few days to weeks and then resolves spontaneously. This is a little harder to study, but where we are seeing this more recently is in instances where people are using synthetic cannabinoids or spice and K2, where this is the usual story of young people who use spice and K2. They are previously normal, they end up in the ER in a psychotic state, and they remain psychotic for several days, even though the acute intoxicating effects of the drugs have worn off. As I mentioned, it lasts beyond the period of intoxication. It typically requires some degree of clinical intervention. And in two studies done, both of which were done in Scandinavia, they looked at people who were hospitalized or taken to the emergency room for a cannabis-related psychosis and followed them almost 20 years out. And they found that between 50 and 75%, depending on what criteria you used, were re-diagnosed with schizophrenia, suggesting that if you experience psychosis in the context of cannabis use, that may be a harbinger of a chronic psychotic disorder. Finally, the third relationship, and this is one of exposure to cannabis in adolescence, followed years and perhaps decades later by the onset of a psychotic disorder. This phenomenon, or this relationship, received a lot of attention following a study done in Sweden, where everyone who was conscripted to the Swedish army, and that's about 50,000 people, were followed for a good 25 years, and they found that those who were exposed to cannabis prior to conscription were, depending on the study you looked at, depending on how the data were analyzed, between 3 and 6 times more likely to develop a schizophrenia disorder. So since then, there have been a number of longitudinal prospective studies. I'm not going to bore you with the details. These were large sample studies, but there's converging evidence from different parts of the world, different longitudinal studies, suggesting that if you've been exposed to cannabis in adolescence, your risk for schizophrenia increases by about 2-fold, and in some studies as high as up to 5-fold. And depending on what your outcome measures, if it's schizophrenia, it's perhaps less. If it's broader than that, it's perhaps more. Two important points here. One is that the timing of exposure appears to be really important. That is, if you've been exposed before the age of 16, your risk is much greater than if you're exposed after the age of 16. So something about brain development occurring before the age of 16 interacts with cannabis in a way that's not good. And the amount of exposure, this is no surprise. So, but the point here is that not everyone who uses cannabis develops a psychotic disorder. Not everyone who has a psychotic disorder has been exposed to cannabis. So cannabis is neither necessary nor sufficient. It's more likely a component cause. But given the fact that it is it is one of the few preventable things that we can do with psychotic disorders. It would be important for us to study more systematically. It looks like it's more likely that cannabinoids interact with genes, and now there have been several genes that have been identified, polymorphisms of several genes that have been identified to confer increased risk for psychosis outcomes with exposure to cannabis. And then family history. My colleague Mohini Ranganathan is doing a study where we're taking individuals with a family history of schizophrenia who are not diagnosed themselves, and they appear to have a greater response to THC in the laboratory that's intermediate to healthy controls and people with schizophrenia. So some have suggested, our own Bruce Rounseville, who was a former member of our department who passed away a few years ago, suggested that perhaps there's a cannabis subtype of schizophrenia. The way I think of schizophrenia, it's probably not one illness, it's probably an amalgam of many different illnesses, but we just don't have the tools necessary to differentiate these, and perhaps there is a cannabis-related subtype. If there is, what is different about it? And that would be really difficult for us to study. We've taken the opportunity to look at a naturally occurring phenomena that might inform us. As you know, it would be impossible for us to do a laboratory study to take people and give them cannabis and see who becomes psychotic, develops a psychotic disorder or not. We can't do that. And furthermore, the kind of people who end up in our laboratory studies tend to be people who may be a little more adventurous. They're not representative of the general population. And furthermore, we exclude them if they have a history of psychosis. So can we study this in some other way? And we stumbled upon a natural occurrence that allows us to look at this. There are festivals that occur in India. One festival is called Holi, which is a festival of color where people throw color on each other. It's really to announce the spring harvest. And one of the customs during Holi is that large swaths of the population will use cannabis, a certain form of cannabis that's peculiar to India. And there's another festival called Mahashivratri in honor of the god Shiva, who had apparently a fondness for cannabis, where people, large swaths of the population will use cannabis. I have a study that's funded by NIDA, and we just went down in February to actually collect data. These are festivals that occur every year at the same time, so we have the opportunity to go there and sit and wait. The study that we are doing is based on the hypothesis that some people who, after using cannabis, and these are people from the general population, will experience a clinically significant psychotic disorder, and perhaps if we can study them, we might understand what's unique about a cannabis-related psychosis. Furthermore, cannabis is actually issued by the government. They have government retailers that distribute cannabis, shown here in the picture on the far left, and these are the different forms of cannabis that are available. They are available as fritters, as donuts, as milkshakes, as other sweetmeats, and again, because they're consumed orally, if you have a risk for psychosis, or you're not comfortable with the way cannabis might make you feel, once you consume it, 3 hours later you're in trouble. And so in some ways, the way that cannabis is consumed around these festivals promotes the likelihood of seeing a psychotic reaction. So we have a study that we're doing in a city called Ranchi in the eastern part of India, where they have the Central Institute of Psychiatry, which is the oldest psychiatric hospital in Asia, and they see about a 3 to 4-fold increase in psychosis cases shortly after these festivals. And so we went down and we collected data, and we've been looking at the following idea, that maybe in the general population, around these festivals, some people use, some people don't. Of the people who use, some develop psychosis, some don't. Of the people who develop psychosis, some end up in the hospital, some don't. And we have an opportunity to capture those people who are hospitalized at this institution. What we found here in our preliminary data are that there is a distinct EEG signature to those who have psychosis in the context of cannabis use. And this is distinct from individuals who have a psychotic disorder that's unrelated to cannabis. These are again preliminary data, but perhaps we will have an opportunity to actually try and tease out these different subtypes of what we currently call schizophrenia, but might actually consist of many different psychotic disorders. So, just to summarize cannabis and psychosis, they're clearly acute psychotic-like effects. The effects are dose-dependent. patients with schizophrenia and their family members are more vulnerable to the effects of cannabis. Cannabis may hasten or precipitate psychosis in individuals with who are vulnerable, and there's mounting evidence that that cannabis may be a component factor in the risk for schizophrenia. So I'm going to conclude there. I've shown you evidence about that there's limited efficacy, limited evidence to support the therapeutic use of cannabis for psychiatric indications. I don't think there's really any data right now to support that. And in contrast, there are significant concerns about both acute and chronic effects. We continue to need high quality research to inform us, especially research about why adolescence is a particularly vulnerable time for exposure to cannabis. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, that was terrific, because there's such a politically correct line amongst many adolescents and even well-thinking people is that it's no more than a drink of alcohol. We see a lot of kids in the anxiety OCD clinic who want to argue to their parents that they're treating their anxiety naturally. And I was wondering if you could say something about the anxiety effects of marijuana, where I think there may be difference between the acute and chronic use, and also the effects on motivation and depression.
Great question. So first thing, the issue of treating something naturally. So I get this question all the time. It's natural, it's been around for a long time. Well, it's herbal. How bad could that be? Well, so is cocaine, so is tobacco, so is digitalis, and you name it. There are many other plant-based products that are not without side effects. What's peculiar about cannabis is that it has biphasic effects. Cannabinoids in general have biphasic effects. That is to say that at certain doses it can have effects going in one direction. So it could have anxiolytic effects at small doses, and it could have anxiogenic effects at high doses. I spoke a lot about psychosis, but there are people who end up in the ER with panic-like attacks, acute paranoia after using cannabis for the first time. So cannabis and cannabinoids have biphasic effects. I think what happens over time is that because of tolerance and dependence, while the first time someone uses cannabis and they may experience anxiolytic effects, that might be okay, but if they continue to use it, they're going to lose that effect, and there may be some evidence that actually they may become anxious after a while. So my subjects in the study that I showed you, where we looked at brain imaging, looking at CB1 receptors, we asked them, what is the most difficult thing about giving up cannabis? And they say that after using it repeatedly over time, when they try to stop using it, the most prominent effect that they experience immediately is anxiety-like effects. So they experience anxiety-like effects, sleep disturbances, and difficulties with appetite. And these were not present before they started using cannabis. So I think it's a bad idea. You should know that June 7th, the state of Connecticut medical marijuana program is entertaining a petition to approve cannabis for anxiety disorders. And so that will be on the table. Those of you who are concerned about this, I encourage you to write or to provide testimony so that our legislators can be a little more informed about the consequences of that.
Regarding the legalization efforts for recreational marijuana in Connecticut, what's being said in terms of age limits? And I'm just curious also in other states that have legalized recreational marijuana.
So age limit is 21, and that's what Connecticut is thinking about. So the position I held when I provide testimony to the legislators is that I'm concerned about kids and what impact it would have on kids. I have a 15-year-old son who's at that time where in high school kids are talking about this and doing it. So I have concerns about kids, and they assured me, well, it's not going to be for kids, it's going to be for 21-year-olds. But as we've seen, in states where marijuana has been legalized, either for recreational or medical purposes, they have higher rates of teen cannabis use, because it's very perplexing to, my own son says, So it's medically approved, so why should it be bad? And it's hard for them to wrap their heads around something like that. So for now it's 21, and I don't think that's going to change. There's been some talk in some states about increasing it to the age of 25 because some legislators have heard clearly that the brain continues to develop till the age of 25.
Don't you think the public doesn't know enough about this? What can we do so the legislators are more informed about these very concerning rates? And then particularly I'm alluding to the chronic effect, the one that may occur, persist, or re-emerge later on, where the connection between the exposure and the symptoms is more hard to establish. It seems to me there haven't been that many New York Times articles on things like that, as there have been about other issues, perhaps less worthy of being discussed in the population. And I think we have the responsibility as scientists to make sure that not just the legislators, but the public at large knows about this, because it's often done, alcohol perhaps has similar effect or whatever, but I think you agree that it's a different story there. We're not going to abolish alcohol, but there is here one opportunity for us to avoid serious consequences for young